Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Storage as Wires. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have with us on the line guest speakers from Customized Energy Solutions and from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Before I pass it over to our excellent panel, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you have to click on the orange arrow that you see circled in the picture of your webinar console there. And you can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console. One of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. We will be saving about 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience following our presentations. And I do expect that we'll have a lot of questions today because we had a lot of people register for this exciting topic. So do type your questions in when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email this afternoon with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of all of the webinar slides. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's also where we post information about all of our archived and upcoming webinars. So with that, I would like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Val Story. Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started.
Great, thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. This is Val Story. Thanks for the introduction, Sam. Today we're going to be talking about storage as wire solutions, but first I wanted to introduce the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We are a national member-supported nonprofit, and you can see all our members on the slide in front of you. They are primarily state energy offices from around the country, and we work with these members to support and grow state clean energy policies and programs and innovative technologies. And we have a particular focus on renewable energy technologies, on energy storage, on resiliency, and on equity, and on buildings. And with our state members, we develop partnerships with other organizations, including federal agencies. We do things like manage multi-state projects, and we provide technical assistance to our state members. You can learn more about us, of course, at cesa.org. Next slide. So as Sam mentioned, we have two presenters today. I'm going to introduce them each as they begin their presentation. So first, I will present John Fernandes, who is going to be talking about and walking us through some policy milestones, including FERC policy statements and issues and barriers. In general, both panelists are going to be talking about storage as transmission, storage as wires, storage as a grid asset, and we'll be discussing issues and solutions to treating energy storage systems as a dual use asset, so both for generation and for transmission, and how these systems and these projects can recover costs for these services and also recover revenue from market-based services. So John's going to provide us with some background, again, some policy milestones, talk about issues and barriers, and then we're going to move on to Ariel from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, who's going to provide an update on Mass's energy storage programs, including the ASIS grant program and projects that program has supported, including utility, behind the meter, and non-utility systems. So let's kick it off with John. John Fernandes joined Customized Energy Solutions after nearly 5 years in the development, construction, and IPP sectors, managing policy and creating new market opportunities across renewable, fossil, transmission, and energy storage business lines. And before that, John was on the staff at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and a regulatory manager, and was a regulatory manager for an investor-owned utility. He has offered expertise in international markets, including Canada, the UK, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. He has an MBA from the University of Delaware and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins University. John, thanks for being here. We're going to pass the mic over to you for now.
All right, Val, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Clean Energy States Alliance for the opportunity to share some information here today. So again, John Fernandes, Senior Consultant with Customized Energy Solutions. Very quickly, we are what I call a markets-centric strategy consulting firm. We are extremely familiar with the ISOs, RTOs across North America. I apologize for the background noise. Of course, the ambulance had to drive by right now. We also have international offices in Pune, India, in Japan. So we really are familiar with regulatory structures around the world. CES is also a scheduling entity across North America. We have a 24-hour operations center in downtown Philadelphia. The 11 gigawatt portfolio includes wholesale resources, retail programs, and over 300 megawatts of energy storage. And then there's our emerging technologies group where I sit. And so we cover energy storage, electric vehicles, microgrids. We're into the manufacturing sector. So we really, again, take a global perspective on bringing these resources to the grid. So real quick, just to make sure everyone on the call here is reading from the same script on the same page. There's a lot of references to precedent and policy in the background that I'm going to provide. And much of that is either within markets, and these are the wholesale markets as you see here, and especially under FERC jurisdiction, which is 6 of the 7, the ERCOT, the Texas market, is not under FERC jurisdiction. And then we have activities, some within, but really outside the wholesale market, outside of FERC jurisdiction, where a lot of the decisions are left up to the state commissions. Structurally on the grid, now these lines are getting blurred day by day as you start to have more and more distributed resources, retail resources participating in wholesale markets. But typically what we look at is the wholesale opportunity and the bulk system or the transmission system, and then distributed resources on the distribution system down to retail opportunities. So across today, we're going to be talking about energy storage, really filling in needs that are on the bulk electric system and on the distribution system. And then with the dual use premise, we'll be talking about participation of those resources as well in the wholesale energy markets, as you saw on the last slide. So for the policy background, some major milestones that took place as we got to the point today where we can really start talking about storage as wires projects. The first one I like to flag is Western Grid. This is going back to roughly the 2010 timeframe. A commercial entity in the California ISO market wanted to deploy an energy storage facility to meet a wires need on the Cal ISO system. It was submitted as an economic project. Really, when you're talking about, at least at the transmission level, when you're talking about wires projects, transmission projects, they typically fall into one of 3 main categories: economic, public policy, or reliability. So economic, I think one of the best examples there is congestion, because congestion impacts market prices, and so it's economic. Reliability are more thermal overloads, N-1 and 2 contingencies, voltage stability. These aren't really things that get monetized per se in terms of clearing prices, but they very much impact reliability. And then public policy are things like incorporating renewable energy, transmission of renewable energy. So the developer in Western Grid had a project classification and also had precedent. They were able to compare the sodium sulfur batteries to capacitors, and capacitors for a long time have been recognized as transmission infrastructure, wires infrastructure. They go into cost-based recovery. You do not treat a capacitor as a generator going into a supply resource plan. So the developer was able to find FERC precedent saying these resources get treated as infrastructure. So the developer really did their due diligence in defining what these batteries were going to do and how they would be classified as a transmission resource. California ISO, not quite as on board. The biggest concern there was manipulating prices in the market. If you have a resource that's getting full cost recovery via a regulated rate of return, the idea, at least at Western Grid's time, is this thing is still injecting and withdrawing energy from the grid. So it's going to have to be captured in the market. And we're going to have to clear the resource in the market. Meanwhile, the resource really needs zero operating dollars. And so what you start to run into there is market price suppression. That was a big concern for the California ISO. Western Grid was conditionally approved by FERC, but ultimately never built. And so along the way, and I'm thinking back more maybe to the 2013, 2014 timeframe when I was in the commercial space, I was starting to talk to especially utilities about using storage as an infrastructure project. And they would ask, what kind of precedent do we have? And I would say, well, Western Grid, where nothing got built. And you can imagine that conversation did not go exactly how I wanted it to go. 2017, we had a lot of regulatory uncertainty, finally, at least on the federal level. And finally, in 2017, FERC came out with their policy statement. And the policy statement was really FERC saying, look, this is a thing. Storage is wires, storage is transmission from FERC's perspective. And really, FERC took it a step further, because when you get into the details of the policy statement, they really started to get into that dual use business model where you had the regulated cost recovery for operational functions with earning revenues in an organized market. FERC recognized that this would help the business case for storage. FERC recognized that if you allowed capture of revenues from a market, you could decrease the rate impact on your ratepayers. And that's regulatory gold right there, especially if you're improving service with lower rates. Very, very easy win for a regulator. FERC expressed, though, that the concern remained, how do you make sure that a resource with a regulated rate of return is not suppressing prices in energy markets? And so FERC even went and provided some cost recovery structures that could help address this. You could take the asset owner could get less of a cost recovery upfront and just make up that difference with revenues from the market. As a regulator, you like that because the reduced rate impact is immediate. The project owner developer is going to take a little bit more risk because now you have upfront market exposure. Or you can do a full cost recovery upfront and then credit those revenues back to load or ratepayers. A little administratively probably more complex, but it still gets you to the same place. The policy statement was great. I was very excited to see it. A good friend of mine, FERC attorney, reminds me all the time that policy statements are legally toothless. And so it was a great signal from FERC, but it really wasn't legal precedent on which you could build anything. So we had these really two milestones from FERC that are still leaving the industry kind of scratching their heads is, okay, we think we can do this. We're not really sure exactly how FERC wants us to do this. But all the while, projects are actually going into the ground, and these were going in outside of FERC jurisdiction. So there's three that I like to highlight, if for no other reason that a couple of these I had the opportunity to be involved in, and so I can speak to them a little bit better. The first is the Glacier project for Puget Sound Energy up in the state of Washington. Glacier is a town buried in the Cascade Mountains. If you're a good golfer, chances are you could hit a golf ball into Canada from the town of Glacier. There was one piece of infrastructure, one transmission line running to this town. And as you can imagine, in the Cascade Mountains, the weather gets a little severe over the winter, and there were a lot of outage issues for Glacier. And so Puget started to look at energy storage as a resiliency project. When I was working to these guys, I kept calling it an infrastructure upgrade deferral project, and they finally corrected me and said, there is no infrastructure upgrade that is on the table here. We are not trying to run more wires into this location. And so ultimately they took a storage project, paired it with a small run-of-river hydro system that was there at the town. And sure enough, it provides enough critical service to the town in a time of outage where crews can get out there, address the issue, get the town back up and running. the one nice thing about Glacier is these issues on the grid are very predictable, right? They were really concentrated in those winter months. And so other times of year, Puget was able to quantify other, let's call them more supply or generator type benefits in terms of balancing services, more reliability. And so they were able to make a great economic business case for this that they brought to their state regulators. The other one I like to flag is the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program that Con Ed rolled out. I think you're talking on a timeline shortly after Puget deployed Glacier. Storage for Brooklyn Queens, again, was part of a program. And you can look, this graphic down here is actually for Con Ed's project. There was switching, demand management, voltage optimization. There were a number of steps and activities Con Ed would take to manage the overload on this particular substation. And then when you look at what the battery was doing, really it's energy arbitrage. It's charge low, sell high, and really when I say low and high, I'm talking grid utilization, which typically transfers into market prices, but we're talking grid utilization for a wires resource. The state of New York is a deregulated market, very different than the vertically integrated utility, Puget Sound Energy. The state of New York said, yes, New York utilities, you can own storage if it's being used as a wires asset. You cannot function in the New York ISO market, so we're not even going to worry about this whole dual use thing. And so Con Ed was able to deploy this project with this utilization profile and get the cost recovery they needed within their rates. This type of notion is what you're seeing really getting up into the Northeast, the ISO New England states. Ariel is going to provide some great project examples. And again, it's utility ownership. To the best of my knowledge, none of these guys are yet participating in the ISO New England market. So very, very good precedent was set here at the state level. The last one I'd like to talk about is Presidio down in Texas. So Texas not under FERC jurisdiction, everything falls to the state. And so I say not Presidio. It's a great project, but I use that as a lesson in regulatory caution. So Presidio is a town. They I believe it's in AEP's territory. They put a battery at a substation where it was a similar situation to Glacier. A lot of outage issues, really bad power quality, especially in the heat of the summer. And so they put this storage resource there to mitigate those issues. I don't even think Presidio is metered in the ERCOT market. They don't even know it's there. What I caution is right around the same time, right after Presidio went in and AEP was granted rate recovery, the state of Texas said, hey, we want to be able to let storage participate in the market. And so legislatively, they defined energy storage as a generation resource, and that gave them access to interconnection, to market participation, and everyone stood up and cheered, yay, storage in the market. Several years later, this is a few years ago, AEP came back to the table wanting to get cost recovery for some distribution level storage projects, very small projects, again, providing operational benefits. And there were some folks that came to the table and said, nope, state of Texas, you have defined storage as a generation resource. AEP is a deregulated utility in what is, by the way, a very deregulated market in Texas. And utilities like AEP and Encore have been really stonewalled in front of the commission. They have not been able to come up with a way to leverage energy storage as an operational asset. Little update to that, in the 2019 legislative session, there was a bill that made it unanimously through committee to change that. Unfortunately, it never made it to the floor. Almost the same bill was reintroduced this year in the 2021 session, so they're trying again, we'll see. But it's one of those things where as you're forming policy, especially for very new applications such as this, just really make sure to think about how you're classifying storage. And fortunately, the industry has gotten away from this. We're finally just treating storage as storage instead of storage as generation, storage as load, whatever it may be. Okay, so that was more background all the way up to now what I consider to be really the most significant regulatory development in terms of storage as wires. And that is actually real time. Unfortunately, it's in front of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. But MISO, ATC, American Transmission Company, submitted a storage project into the MISO Transmission Expansion Plan. Entergy submitted one as well. Entergy removed their project from consideration, but ATC pushed it. So really forced the hand of MISO to figure this out, and MISO figured it out and came up with a tariff structure, tariff changes to the tariff that were approved by FERC on how to do this. And so really MISO set up the process of we're going to be evaluating this operationally and economically against what would be considered your more traditional transmission upgrades that would be needed to fix this transmission level issue. MISO made sure to emphasize that they would look at costs over the life of the project. So a lot of times with energy storage, you have what we call system augmentation, somewhere halfway through a project life where you have to basically add battery to maintain the energy capability of that system. So MISO wanted to make sure that all of those, let's just call it an O&M cost along the way, were captured to appropriately value this project. At voltage ride through, reactive power capability, all those requirements would be there just as they are for a lot of these types of resources on the grid. And then the one that I really want to flag is that MISO is going to consider other benefits such as lead time, right of way, flexibility. I'd really never seen these other, let's call them societal type benefits in the consideration when evaluating projects. This was a very big step in this process. So it was ultimately approved by FERC. The one remaining source of contention that's going to have to get figured out across the board is cost recovery. MISO is using attachment O in the tariff. Attachment O is for capital T, capital C transmission companies. Well, there are entities out there that are developing storage that now commercial third parties can become transmission companies. It's just a very onerous and expensive process, and some of them don't want to have to go through that. Other companies that want to do this might be distribution companies, and per state law, a distribution company cannot become a transmission company to leverage attachment O. And there's plenty of other questions out there. This is one of the main things in front of the circuit court, but leveraging an existing mechanism is a great way to get something done, but you could end up creating a barrier to entry for other entities that want to and can do this. The biggest thing with all of this is that the industry is moving on, already talking about dual use storage. ATC has come right out and said, look, once this thing is up and running, we want to participate in the market and capture some revenues that way. Raises a whole new suite of questions. Really, the core one is going back to how do you not suppress prices in the market? Allowing the ISO to manage through. So one thing that was established in the MISO conversations is that it's MISO staff. As a transmission asset, MISO calls the shot. They are not turning that over to a commercial entity. Well, when it comes to market participation, first of all, the commercial entities do not want to give up that control, but also an ISO is not allowed to participate in its own market. So along the way, you have to draw the lines of who's going to have operational control and when. I think for the most part, that's pretty clear until you start getting into managing state of charge. Managing state of charge is an operational decision. It is an economic decision. You do have to do it economically, but it's still based on operational needs, especially for the wires function. The idea is for storage as transmission, the cost of managing state of charge is not allocated to the storage plant. It just goes to load just as the regular operation of the plant would go. For market participation purposes, it's economic for the asset owner. Well, if I'm an asset owner participating commercially and I'm managing state of charge, if I want to get out of paying for my managing state of charge, I just have to say, no, I'm actually doing this for the operational requirements. So it's basically free money. I have yet to find a way to precisely distinguish when you are managing state of charge for what purpose. And so there is a market manipulation risk there that has to be figured out really before I think regulators are going to have a lot of confidence in this platform. And then the other thing has to do with interconnection queue studies. It was decided in the MISO process that storage as transmission would not go through the interconnection queue, really because transmission operators can't wait for a project to go through the queue. This is an annual kind of thing for them. That was considered unfair for generation developers. And so some folks identified this storage as transmission thing as a way to circumvent the interconnection queue. And so in terms of fairness, how do you address that? But then in terms of just being reasonable, if there's a resource already operating on the grid and it can then participate in the market, do you really have to send it through a 6 or a 7 year interconnection study process? Again, that seems a bit onerous. So something else to have to figure out. But this, again, the hand is going to be forced. This is what entities want to do. It is very good for ratepayers in terms of keeping costs down, being able to capture revenues from a market. So that is it for me. Thanks again for the time, a little bit of background there. I'm looking forward to what Ariel has to bring to the table. I think it's very important to flag actual projects that are going in place. It just makes this opportunity that much more tangible. So with that, I think, Val, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for those great examples and raising those key issues. Yes, we'll now turn to Ariel Horowitz for an update on Massachusetts and a deeper dive into some Massachusetts-specific projects. Ariel Horowitz is Senior Program Director at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, where she oversees much of MassCEC's work supporting commercialization of new energy innovations by researchers and early-stage companies. And she directs MassCEC's market development work related to resiliency, energy storage, and clean transportation. Ariel joined MassCEC from Synapse Energy Economics, and she holds a PhD in chemical engineering from Tufts and a bachelor's of science in engineering from Swarthmore College. Ariel, thanks for being here, and we can turn things over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Val, and thanks for having us here today to talk about some of our updates from the ACES program. And thanks to John as well for the great overview and background. So just to do a brief agenda of what I'm planning to cover, I'll start out with a brief introduction of MassCEC, and then talk a little bit about how at least we're thinking about what wires type value streams are for storage. Obviously, value stacking is the sort of key economic driver for energy storage, and so thinking about which of those values in that stack are really wires type is I think sort of a big theme going through. Then I'll introduce the Advancing Commonwealth Energy Storage, or ACES program, go through a couple of case studies from within that program and a couple of case studies from outside of that program, and then just wrap up with some takeaways and themes. So just to introduce MassCEC, the Mass Clean Energy Center is a quasi-public state agency in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are a ratepayer-funded agency, and our mission is to accelerate the clean energy and climate economy in the Commonwealth as we are driving towards meeting our climate goals of net zero by 2050. We have a couple of different types of activities that we do in terms of funding, technology development, workforce development, and market development across 4 different focus areas. We work a lot on high performance buildings, clean transportation. We have a big offshore wind team that's working with that industry as those projects start getting spun up in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And then an area of work that we call net zero grid, which is really thinking about as we drive towards a vision for 2050 that really focuses on massive electrification of energy end uses and significant efficiency, and then sort of fueling that all with a clean electric grid. What is it that we need out of the grid to get us to that 2050 vision? So our energy storage work falls under this net zero grid area of work. So just to start out with a little bit of background in terms of how we're thinking about benefits. Before the Commonwealth started developing policy specific to energy storage or funding pilot and demo work around energy storage through the ACES program, we commissioned a report called State of Charge that was looking at what the anticipated benefits to the Commonwealth's ratepayers could be from energy storage. And that was a pretty comprehensive report, and the key figure is there on the right, where it was going through all the different value streams that we could imagine that storage would offer, and sort of stacking those up to see, is it worth the Commonwealth pursuing sort of an energy storage market development policy regime. Obviously, we found that it really was. There were really significant benefits that could be found through energy storage, but a couple of them were specifically benefits that we can think of as wires type. You'll see the biggest benefit there was actually reduced peak, which is not something that I'm thinking of as a wires type benefit in this case, because that really has to do primarily with reducing the costs and avoiding having to procure generation through the forward capacity auction in ISO New England. So that's really more of a generation focused application. Anything having to do with peak on the wires side is something that's circled there, the lower red circle, T&D cost reduction. I also circled there increased renewable integration as a wires type benefit, because it's sort of replacing doing an upgrade with a traditional wires solution. You can do increased renewable integration through energy storage, as I'll mention in one of the case studies. I think the key there, how are we defining a value stream that's a wires type value stream? The function that the storage is performing could not be performed solely with traditional generation. And the function serves to avoid incurring capital rather than avoiding allocation of undepreciated capital. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, demand charge reduction is a really big customer driver for energy storage in terms of having behind the meter energy storage that reduces a customer's apparent peak. We wouldn't necessarily think of that as a wires type application, especially because the way that demand charges are functioning within a cost of service study, you're really looking at allocation of the cost of the existing transmission or distribution system down to individual ratepayers based on their contribution to circuit coincident peak, which is kind of an analog to the customer's individual peak, coming, at least in our understanding, from a regime in which tracking each customer's individual peak and the level of coincidence is both logistically difficult without advanced metering infrastructure, and also difficult for customers to respond to. However, when you use storage to reduce a customer peak, that does reduce the customer's costs and can have a great economic payback when you're talking about reducing a peak that is collecting back undepreciated capital of the existing system. I don't know that I would classify that as a wires type value stream that storage is providing to all ratepayers. It's more focused on that individual customer's economics. So that said, to go into the ACES program and a couple of the case studies, the Advancing Commonwealth Energy Storage Program was a grant program that the MassCEC operated jointly with our colleagues at the Department of Energy Resources. We put out a solicitation in 2017, made awards in 2017 for 26 different projects piloting and demonstrating different use cases of energy storage throughout the Commonwealth. Ultimately ended up awarding about $20 million for a big variety of different use cases that you can see diagrammed here. One important thing to note there is that none of them is sort of squarely just a wires application, although we do have some wires type examples, as I'll talk through in a second. And I think that goes back to this question of value stacking and around the challenges for doing storage as wires, is that a lot of the time you actually want to be doing multiple things. So I'll talk through three different case studies. One is energy storage owned by an investor-owned utility. One is energy storage owned by a municipal lighting plant or a municipal utility. And the final one is energy storage owned by a customer as customer-owned storage that's providing a wires function. And I think each of those three has a different kind of take on this question of combining different value streams and what is necessary to have storage provide a wires type value stream. So the first case study, we have a grant to Unitil, which is the smallest of the three investor-owned utilities in Massachusetts. You can see their territory circled in orange in the map on the right. That project is a 2 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour battery energy storage system installed at the utility-owned substation. we gave Unitil a grant of just under $250,000, and the total project costs about $4 million to install this battery. This is a distribution substation, and so the asset is owned and operated by Unitil for sort of distribution wires purposes. The key here is that one of the main value streams that this piece of infrastructure is going to be providing is a transformer deferral. So this particular substation was in high load conditions coming up towards a period of usage where the transformer rating was at risk of being exceeded, and Unitil was looking to defer the upgrade of that transformer by installing storage at the substation, a very classic use case. And there's a couple of things that I think are interesting about this. One is that the deferral obviously is temporary, so they're not replacing a substation deferral. They're not replacing the substation upgrade forever. They're deferring it for 10 years and claiming the savings on that. I think this is one of the key things. You know, storage can get you a lot of value in terms of deferring this type of upgrade, but obviously the battery is not itself a substation, and if ultimately the load does end up growing past where you can economically put in storage to defer, then you will further down the line end up needing that upgrade. The other thing is that they are combining the substation deferral use case with savings in the ISO New England market. So they're not bidding this battery in as an asset in the forward capacity market. Instead, they're using the battery almost as kind of a behind the meter type asset on behalf of Unitil ratepayers to reduce the installed capacity requirement for their service territory. This is kind of an end run around this question of market participation because it's still functioning to provide a savings from kind of the customer end of that market. And this is something that we've seen a lot, both in the ACES program and sort of through storage generally, is that where there's the ability to act more as load than as a generator, it tends to be simpler with respect to at least the ISO New England markets. And so we've seen a lot of storage taking advantage of that type of opportunity so as to not have to go in through the entire bid process, for example. You'll also see on the figure there on the left, the bars in yellow are this question around providing regulation service with the battery, which is also something that Unitil has contemplated, but it's not clear to us whether or not in practice this project just started operating, whether or not in practice Unitil is actually going to successfully bid the battery into the regulation market on a regular basis. That is something that I think would get into these interesting kind of cost recovery questions, but one thing that we have seen through the ACES program is that the regulation market is not as lucrative or as certain of a revenue stream as many folks intended it to be or anticipated it to be. And so I think for that reason, we really do anticipate the main sort of financial case for this battery being the transformer deferral and the ICAP savings rather than participation in the ISO markets. The second case study I want to go through is a battery owned by the ASHBURNHAM municipal lighting plant. This is one of about 51 municipal lighting plants in the state of Massachusetts with about 2,800 residential customers, so it's not a huge system. We provided ASHBURNHAM an ACES grant of $600,000 on a total project budget of $2.7 million. And again, the storage asset is owned and operated by the MLP. In this case, municipal lighting plants are not subject to DPU regulation around rates and cost recovery. So the ability of the MLP to think through a cost recovery structure that works, in their opinion, works best for the MLP and their customers, they have a lot more discretion than an investor-owned utility might. And the storage facility in this case is a 3 megawatt, 5 megawatt hour battery at the MLP-owned substation. So there's a couple of different interesting use cases for this particular battery. Again, it's doing ICAP tag reduction, also doing peak reduction for the RNS fee or transmission network access fee that distribution companies are charged in New England. And again, I would classify that not as a wires type value stream, because it's really reducing the cost that's allocated to Ashburnham. The interesting wires type application of this particular storage facility is that the MLP was saturated on solar hosting capacity prior to the installation. So you can see sort of their development of a classic duck curve there on the right in between 2013 and 2014 that had to do both with customer-owned storage within the MLP territory, or sorry, customer-owned solar, as well as development of I believe a landfill covering relatively large PV facility. So the MLP was concerned about a major risk of backflow onto the transmission network during low load conditions. And they found that putting in this battery, which is really mainly being used for peak avoidance during sort of those, the coincident peak hours, both monthly and for the overall ISO system in the summer, but that putting in this storage facility enabled them to up their hosting capacity by about a megawatt throughout the MLP territory. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this particular use case is that it's really only during April and May that they're concerned about this. And so because of that, this use case does not conflict with a summer peak focused dispatch strategy that, again, is really the economic driver. And then the third case study I wanted to go over is a project that's owned by a private customer. We call it the W.H. BENNETT project. It's on Martha's Vineyard. So this is a situation where there's actually a sheep farm. You can see some of the sheep down there on the right that wanted to install a large, a 650 kilowatt solar farm and co-locate with their grazing land, which I think is a great application in terms of overall benefits of PV. However, the line that they were on was totally saturated in terms of PV and had some power quality issues. So what they were told, and I'll go over this in a second, is that putting in a battery would help them with the interconnection actually for the PV. So the grant that we gave in this case was a $382,000 grant on a total project budget of $764,000. So it's not a huge battery. It's a 500 kilowatt, around 1,100 kilowatt hour battery, and it is customer owned. So it's behind a different meter. It's not behind any meter as load, but they're separate standalone facilities to the PV, but they're owned by the same customers. And in this case, as I mentioned, there really is a power quality focused application here. What the customer was told by the EDC in this case when going through the interconnection application was this quote here: "We are running into significant technical constraints with DG interconnections on the vineyard. It may be possible that there are no conventional system upgrades, and you may have to investigate a battery storage solution as part of the interconnection." So the goal here was really to tamp down on voltage flicker because of the relatively large amount of PV on this line and relatively small amount of customer load. There was a lot of voltage flicker that the line was experiencing, especially when clouds would pass through and the PV export rate would ramp too quickly. And so what's going on with this particular battery is that they're being given a signal by Eversource as to how to mitigate that voltage flicker, but this only requires at most a 10% swing in the battery state of charge on any given day. Because the system is front of the meter with respect to any kind of customer load, it can't defray customer load for demand charge purposes or participate in sort of peak focused customer demand response programs. And fundamentally what that means is that there really isn't any value stacking in this case. This facility is being used solely to defray this kind of voltage flicker concern, and it's doing so very successfully, and it unlocked the value associated with the PV for this customer. This is something that we would love to see replicated, and also again to go back and think about how to add in additional value, because there's so much state of charge left over, which is kind of an ongoing conversation around who would dispatch that, because of the kind of crucial nature of the voltage flicker remediation function. And then just a couple of quick examples outside of the ACES program, but in Massachusetts, of utility-owned storage as wires. So there's a couple of different projects that have both been proposed by our other larger IOUs, National Grid and Eversource, around avoiding subsea cabling. The Nantucket project, which I know CESA has presented on in the past. There was also a project that Eversource had proposed on, again, on Martha's Vineyard in Oak Bluffs, that was meant to defer addition of a third subsea cable to the vineyard. But one sort of recent development on that project, as of I think about 10 days, is that because the vineyard has actually committed to significant electrification of load as part of their overall climate planning, Eversource had concluded that in fact the storage was not going to be sufficient to defer that need for an additional cable for very long. And so that project is actually not going forward on Martha's Vineyard. And again, it goes back to this question of how much time is the storage going to buy you? It really depends on what's going on the load side. And then kind of an interesting reliability focused project, very similar to the Glacier project that John mentioned. This is the Outer Cape project that Eversource is doing. This project is going forward. I believe it's under construction now. It's a relatively large battery, 25 megawatt, 13 megawatt hour in Provincetown. On a pretty poor performing circuit that goes out to the very tip of Cape Cod. And it should be relatively obvious why the circuit doesn't perform super well. It's that rather spindly distribution line that you can see on the picture on the right is the only distribution line that goes out to Provincetown, and the land to either side is national seashore land, and so building a redundant line there would be quite difficult. The expectation is that storage located in Provincetown will be able to provide anywhere between 1.5 and 10 hours of duration, depending on load conditions, to support customers in Provincetown and back towards the next highest substation in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, for an outage that really could occur at any given point in the year. It's not as the outages can be weather dependent on the Cape, but the Cape is very exposed to weather sort of throughout the entire year. And so sort of the key point there is that Eversource is not planning to use that battery for any other kind of peak or market applications, again, because it's a reliability focused upgrade. The state of charge needs to be available for that purpose. So just to wrap up with a couple common themes and takeaways, we do see that in Massachusetts that storage can serve wires type purposes, but with limits. Deferral is not the same thing as an elimination of need. The ownership and the regulation do remain a little bit complex, especially when thinking about getting into the markets, but there are ways, especially in ISO New England, to think about how to act sort of more as a customer. In the economic model, as always, value stacking is one of the core strategies for storage. But when you think about specifically reliability type use cases, it can be really tricky to get that value stacking and still have the state of charge that you need to provide that reliability focused use case. If you can separate the value streams either by time of day or especially seasonally, that can really help. And again, I would say, when it comes to wires, the reliability is really the primary need in a lot of these cases. And so we do think that that's worth paying for if you can get it. But again, it goes back to this question of it's always going to be a limited duration, and thinking through that storage can actually get you the value that you're looking for in that case. So thanks very much, and I'll pass it back to Val.
Thank you, Ariel. We can now move on to the Q&A portion. If you haven't yet typed in a question, feel free to do so in the question dialog box, and we will try to get to them. While we have Ariel's slides still up, oh, sorry, Sam, you can throw Ariel's slides back up. We can begin with two related questions. One of them is just asking for a little more explanation on and definition of value stacking. So I thought maybe we could look at Ariel's, I don't know, maybe it was her third or fourth slide. And Ariel, if you could just give a brief
Sure.
overview on what is value stacking. And related to that, there was a follow-up question about the BENNETT case on what incentives or payments there were to the customer or the owner if there's no value stacking in that use case.
Sure, absolutely. So value stacking, we just mean that the compared to really, I think the comparison is to solar generation, where by and large you would think of solar as providing you maybe a net metering benefit and a REC benefit, and those are the two benefits that you can get, and it's a relatively simple economic case. For energy storage, because energy storage can perform all of these different types of applications, you see here peak reduction, renewable integration, ancillary services cost reduction, energy cost reduction, wholesale, right? A wide range of different applications depending on how you dispatch the storage and when you dispatch the storage. There's a lot of drive to have the return on investment for the storage be provided by multiple different of these applications. So some, if some of your ROI comes from a peak reduction, some of your ROI comes from demand response, some of your ROI comes from participation in ancillary services market. And by cobbling together these multiple different values, you end up with a project that has a strong payback case. In the BENNETT situation, the payback is actually provided entirely by revenue through the SMART program, which is the solar incentive tariff that we have in Massachusetts. So essentially the customer would not have been able to add this solar facility if they had not also added the storage. So the revenue that they're getting through SMART pays back not just the solar, but also the storage as well.
Thank you for that. Ariel, are there other policies or programs in Massachusetts other than ACEs that you haven't talked about that would make some of these use cases and examples that you've provided unique to Massachusetts, or would you say, at least in ISO New England, that they're highly replicable?
I would say the BENNETT case is a little bit unique, again, because that really depended, it's less depending on sort of our state policy regime and more on this kind of one-off approach to mitigation of an interconnection issue. Again, I think we want to see that replicated, and we would love to see it also replicated outside of Massachusetts. It's just a tricky thing with respect to interconnection study. In terms of the Unitil and the ASHBURNHAM cases, no, neither of those projects are really taking advantage of anything that I think is super specific to Massachusetts. We do have a program called the Clean Peak Standard that started operating after these projects were originally conceptualized, but neither of the entities is eligible to participate in that program. So I do think both of those use cases could potentially be replicated elsewhere, although in the MLP case, the ASHBURNHAM case, you would have to have pretty significant exposure to the RNS fee structure to make the payback look similar to how it looks for ASHBURNHAM. And I think there are some municipal type entities elsewhere in New England, but the number of them that we have is a relatively unique Massachusetts element.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to some questions that are for either or for both of you. So in all your experience, is there a particular type of battery or another kind of energy storage solution that you'd say is best suited for a storage and wires function? Ariel, I think you've put it in the slides, but are all these lithium-ion batteries in the examples you've provided?
Yes, all of these are lithium-ion batteries. We do have one ACES grant out to a flywheel project, and I think you could, in theory, do a similar type of project with a flywheel installation, but it's the financing on it would be a little bit tricky, I think, because they tend to be relatively lower duration even than a lithium-ion battery. And a lot of these, for example, the substation deferral case for Unitil, it does depend on having enough duration on the battery to provide sort of the energy throughput necessary to defer to bring that transformer level down from the overload case. The BENNETT case, I think a flywheel would have been totally fine for, given how it's being used. We also had one grant to a vanadium redox flow type project. What we found on that is that market is not very mature in terms of the supply and availability of that technology. So I don't see any reason why it couldn't work if you could get through the procurement, but it's just tricky in terms of actually being able to procure the technology.
Great. So it sounds like from your experience, a variety of technologies would be applicable. John, anything to add there?
I think that was all very well stated. I mean, the examples that I gave, Glacier for Puget, Brooklyn, Queens, those are what you would call fairly traditional electrochemical batteries that are on the market. We see favorable economics, and we can just talk lithium, probably the predominant technology out there. 6 hours is a perfectly reasonable duration when it comes to economically deploying these resources. Some of the applications we've been talking about, especially for reliability purposes, if it's a voltage flicker, if it's a thermal overload, those, there's probably a transmission operator sitting out there saying, I can give you an example otherwise, I'm sure. But generally speaking, I think you can get away with shorter duration resources to mitigate those issues. As you start to get more into the economic issues, so I'm talking congestion or reliability in terms of just serving load for an extended period of time, I think that's when the industry might start looking towards flow type systems that are more and more starting to be researched and brought to more wide scale availability in the market. So we might start to see a transition towards those assets as the use case sort of broadens a little bit more beyond voltage stability, thermal overloads, et cetera.
Perfect, thank you. And that answered a follow-up question there on the duration of batteries for these storage as wires projects. So I know we just have a few minutes left. Let's see if we can move through one or two more. John, there's a question for you, wondering if you are familiar with the virtual transmission projects or the concept of virtual transmission projects being piloted in Europe, where the energy storage solution is located close to the generation site and charges, while simultaneously a different energy storage solution is in a congested area, discharges and is avoiding any market impact. Are you familiar with those, and anything you want to comment on there?
Yeah, I'm broadly speaking, just talking in terms of storage, and I'll just stick with the theme of storage as wires. It might not be exactly what we're talking about in those European scenarios. But yes, one thing, especially the commercial world is trying to figure out is how to site storage to address congestion issues. Because congestion, as I said earlier, congestion contributes to high prices. And that is something that would be attractive to a developer for storage for a generation purpose. But if you fix the congestion issue, it's no longer contributing to the price, and you therefore hurt your own business case. And so that's why the industry is trying, and this is really why the concept of non-wires alternatives came up. That was really written for generators fixing congestion issues that needed a better cost recovery model than market revenues. They needed a fixed-based cost recovery. So yes, in terms of siting strategy, exactly where you're putting that resource and having one charge versus one discharge, the industry is actively figuring this out. And I think the big question becomes, are you relying on a market revenue, or can you actually get a regulated rate of return for that application?
Great, thank you. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. John and Ariel, thank you for walking us through various use cases, giving us examples, walking us through the history and FERC proceedings, considering storage as wires. This concludes today's webinar. We did record the webinar. You will get an email with a link to the recording probably in a few days. And if you're interested in listening in on and participating in future webinars, our next webinar is on June 16th. It's on community resilience hubs, and it's the usual link, cesa.org/webinars. Hope you can make it to that one. Thanks everyone for being here and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ariel. Thanks, Sam.